Nara had 3 coins left in her jacket pocket when the boy tried to sell her a dog. She was not looking for a dog. She was not even looking at the market stalls anymore. Her feet were moving her home the way feet do after a double shift, automatically, without permission, following the shortest path back to the room where she could finally sit down. The packhouse kitchen had kept her from 6 in the morning until almost 9 at night. Her hands smelled like onion water and dish soap. Her shoes were wet. She had eaten half a bread roll standing at the sink at noon and nothing after that. The market square in the pack settlement was nearly empty at that hour. Most of the vendors had folded their carts and gone. A few lanterns still burned at the far end of the square where the produce sellers stacked their empty crates, and the light they threw was long and orange and made the whole square look like the end of something. The boy was maybe 11 years old. He sat on the bottom step of the dry goods store with a cardboard box between his knees. The box had holes punched in the sides. There were sounds coming from it. Small, warm, animal sounds. Nara would have walked past him. She told herself that later, many times. She would have walked straight past and gone home and gone to sleep, and none of it would have happened the way it did. But the boy said, "Please, miss," and there was something in the word please that she could not walk away from. She had heard that word said in too many ways over the years. The way the kitchen staff said it when the head cook was in a terrible mood. The way the younger pack children said it at dinner when someone had taken the last roll. The way she had said it herself, more times than she could count, to people who did not stop. She stopped. "I have puppies," the boy said. He looked up at her. He had tired eyes for an 11-year-old. "My mother said I cannot bring them home again. She said if I come back with the box, she will put them out in the field." Nara looked at the box. "How many?" "4, the boy said. 3 are sold. There is 1 left." She looked into the box. The last puppy was in the corner of it, separate from the shredded newspaper the others had slept in. It was small and gray and had something over its head. A piece of burlap sacking had been tied loosely around its neck, covering its face entirely. "Why does it have that on?" Nara asked. The boy shifted on the step. He did not answer right away. The people who looked at them today did not want to touch that one. They said it was bad luck. They said the eyes were wrong. He paused. "I put the sack on so people would not be afraid of it." Nara crouched down beside the box. The puppy with the sack over its head was completely still. It was not struggling. It was not making any noise. It simply sat there in its corner, under its covering, in the quiet that had settled around it like something earned. "How much?" Nara asked. The boy looked at her carefully, the way children look at adults when they are trying to figure out what kind of adult they are dealing with. 5 coins, he said. She had 3 in her pocket. She thought about that for exactly 2 seconds. Then she unzipped the small compartment of her bag where she kept her emergency money, a 10-coin note folded into a square, and she gave the boy 15 coins in total. He stared at the money. "Keep the change," she said, "and go home." She lifted the puppy out of the box with both hands, jacket and all, and tucked it against her chest. It weighed almost nothing. She could feel it breathing, short, even breaths. Nothing panicked, as if it had been waiting for this, as if it had known she was coming. She walked home with it against her chest and did not once think about how she was going to feed it. Her room in the pack house was on the lowest floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled like old paint and floor cleaner. The Omega quarters had always been on the lowest floor, near the laundry and the storage rooms, where the pipes made noise at night, and the ceiling got damp when it rained for too long. Nara had lived in this room for 2 years. Before that, she had lived in a smaller room 2 doors down. Before that, she had lived in her mother's room, in the corner on a folding cot, until her mother had left the pack and Nara had not gone with her. She sat down on her bed, set the puppy on her lap, and untied the burlap sack. The knot was loose. It came undone in seconds. She lifted the covering away slowly, the way you lift something when you are not sure what is underneath. The puppy looked up at her. Nara had expected something sad. A milky eye, maybe, or a scar, or the kind of wound that would explain why people had been afraid. She had been prepared for something she would have to learn not to flinch at. What she got was a pair of eyes so steady and so clear that her breath stopped for a moment. They were gold, but not the warm amber gold of a normal dog's eyes. They were the gold of a very old coin, deep and layered, with something behind them that she could not name. He looked at her with those eyes, and he did not look away, and he did not look afraid, and there was no confusion in him at all. He looked like something that had been somewhere uncomfortable for a while, and had simply waited it out until a better option arrived. She held the burlap sack in one hand and looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "You're not scary." He blinked, slow and deliberate. "You're actually not anything yet," she said. "You're very small and you probably need water." She found a shallow bowl under the bathroom sink, filled it, and set it on the floor. She had to carry him over to it and hold him in front of it before he understood what she was offering. He drank without rushing. She sat cross-legged on the floor and watched him drink and tried to think practically about what she was going to do. She had very little food. She had a bag of rice, half a tin of beans, 3 eggs, and a loaf of bread that was 2 days old. She made a small amount of rice water, cooled it, and offered it to him in the bowl. He finished it. She ate the bread and 2 of the eggs and gave him a small piece of egg white, which he took from her fingers with great care. She named him Cinder because of the gray of him, and because of the way he seemed to have come through something. Quiet and still on the other side of it, the way a fire looks in the morning when the burning is done. She put a folded towel at the foot of the bed for him to sleep on. He walked around it once, smelled it carefully, then climbed up onto the bed and settled himself near her feet with his chin on the mattress and his eyes already closing. Nara turned off the light. She lay in the dark listening to the pipes and thinking about the 15 coins she had spent and about the 10-coin note that she had kept folded in her bag since the previous month for the day her shoes finally gave out completely. Her shoes had now given out completely, and she had no note and no coins, and she would be paid again in 9 days. 9 days was manageable. She had managed worse. She fell asleep before she finished the thought. When she woke up, it was still dark, and Cinder was no longer at the foot of the bed. She sat up fast, heart going, and then she saw him. He was sitting at the door, completely upright, completely still, his head level, looking at the door with the focused attention of someone listening to a conversation through a wall. His ears were forward, his tail was still. He was not scratching at the door. He was not whining. He was simply sitting there, watching it, as though the door itself were the most interesting thing in the world. Nara looked at the door. She looked at him. "There's nothing there," she said. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the door. She lay back down, listening, and after a while she heard the faint sound of boots in the hallway, one of the Night Watch pack members doing their round, the same as every night. The sound grew closer, then stopped outside her door for a moment, then moved on. Cinder tracked the sound precisely, his head turning in small, exact increments until the footsteps had passed. Then he stood up, turned around, walked back to the foot of the bed, circled twice, lay down, and closed his eyes. Nara lay very still, looking at the ceiling. She had bought a lot of things over the years with money she should not have spent. A coat that was too expensive that kept her warm for 3 winters. A second-hand book she read until the spine broke. Once, a small pot of good hand cream that she used carefully, a tiny amount each night, to keep the kitchen work from destroying her skin entirely. This was the first time she had spent money she did not have on a living thing. She looked at him at the foot of the bed. The gray of him, the stillness, the gold eyes that had looked at her without a single flicker of uncertainty. She thought about the burlap sack, about sitting in a cardboard box while other people were chosen, about not making noise about it. She recognized that, actually. She knew exactly what that was. In the morning, the pack house was loud by 6 o'clock the way it always was. Doors opening and closing, the clatter from the kitchen 2 floors up, the sound of the upper-rank families in their wider corridors with their better light and their window-facing rooms. Nara could hear all of it through the walls. She had learned to hear the whole building this way, to know by the sounds when breakfast was ready, when the head cook was in a difficult mood, when something had gone wrong somewhere and would eventually come down to the lower floors to find her. She got dressed quietly. Cinder sat on the bed and watched her. She pulled on her work clothes and then crouched in front of him with her hands on her knees, looking at him at eye level. He was looking back at her with those still gold eyes. "I am going to work," she said. "You have to stay here and not make any noise. Can you do that?" He held her gaze. "I am serious," she said. "No noise." He blinked. She left him a small amount of water, the remaining eggs scrambled and cooled on a plate, and she closed the door quietly behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, waiting. No sound. She walked to the end of the hall, waited again. Nothing. She went up to the kitchen and started her shift. At the mid-morning break, she walked quickly to the dry goods store 2 streets from the pack house and used her last small amount of credit to buy a bag of oat flour and a tin of basic dog food. The woman at the store looked at the dog food and looked at Nara and did not say anything. Nara had been a regular customer for 2 years. The woman marked the credit in her book and said she could settle it on payday. Nara said thank you and meant it completely. She was back in the kitchen before anyone noticed she had left. That evening, when she unlocked her door and came in, Cinder was in exactly the same position she had left him, on the bed, sitting upright, watching the door, as if he had not moved once in the 11 hours she had been gone. She set down her bag. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He stepped off the bed and came to her, and for the first time he pressed his head against the side of her leg, briefly, with the same measured quality he had for everything, and then stepped back. It was not a dramatic gesture. He did not jump on her. He did not wag his tail with any particular enthusiasm. He simply acknowledged that she was there, and that this was good, and then he was ready for whatever came next. Nara put her hand on top of his head for a moment. He let her. She fed him, then made her own dinner, and they sat in the small room together in the quiet of the evening, and the room felt different than it had felt the night before, though she could not have said precisely how. Less like storage, perhaps, more like a place someone lived. She ate her dinner and he sat by her feet, and outside the hallway the pack house moved through its nightly sounds, and in the room on the lowest floor at the end of the corridor, for the first time in quite a while, Nara did not spend the evening counting what she was short of. She spent it watching a small gray dog with gold eyes sit beside her in the quiet, perfectly still, and find that perfectly enough. The second week, people began to notice. Not the right people. Not the kind of noticing that leads to help or warmth or a friendly inquiry about how the new pet was settling in. It was the other kind of noticing, the kind that travels through a pack house on its own energy, finding corners and ears and mouths to pass through, until it has become something bigger and sharper than the original fact. The original fact was small. Nara, the Omega girl from the lower corridor, had bought a dog. What it became, as it passed from person to person through the pack house, was a story with a punchline. The Omega girl had spent her last coins on a runt with a sack over its head. She had fed it her dinner. She had talked to it like it was a person. There was laughter in it, not the warm kind. Nara heard about the laughing from Soli, who was 60 years old and lived in the room next to hers and had the specific quality of kindness that comes only from having survived enough difficulty to know what it actually looks like. Soli knocked on her door on a Wednesday evening with a small container of leftover stew and set it on the table without comment, and then looked at Cinder, who was sitting in the center of the room watching her with his gold eyes. Soli looked back at him for a long moment. "Well," she said, and nothing else, in the tone of someone who has just seen something that requires a lot more thinking before it can be discussed. "Is the laughing bad?" Nara asked. She did not pretend she did not know about it. She had never seen the point of pretending. "It's the usual kind," Soli said. "It will run out of air in a few days." Nara nodded. She already knew this. She had been the subject of the usual kind of laughing for most of her 2 years in the pack, and longer than that before. It always ran out of air eventually. You just had to keep your face still and wait. What she had not expected was the dinner. On Thursday, the head cook put Nara on the serving line for the evening meal, which was a rotation assignment that happened to every kitchen worker occasionally. The serving line meant standing at the long table while pack members came through with their trays, and it meant being visible to the entire room in a way that regular kitchen work did not require. Nara stood at her post and served the rice dish without looking at anyone's face more than necessary. She heard the laughter before she saw where it came from. It was a table of the younger upper-rank families, people in their early 20s, well-fed, with the ease in their bodies that comes from having always had enough. One of them was Petra, the Alpha's daughter, who was 22, and had never once spoken to Nara in 2 years, except to send back food or ask for something different. Petra was saying something to the table, and the table was laughing, and the word that reached Nara through the noise was sack, followed by 5 coins, followed by more laughter. Nara served the next person in line, then the next. She kept her hands steady. She kept her face still. She had not brought Cinder with her. He was in her room. But she was thinking about him now, about the particular quality of his stillness, about the way he had sat in that cardboard box under the burlap sack and not made a sound, not struggled, not called for help, just waited, with those eyes looking out at nothing because there was a sack in the way, and waiting anyway. She kept serving. The laughter at Petra's table peaked and then softened into conversation, the way group laughter does. Someone moved on to a different topic. The moment passed. 2 tables over, an older pack member named Glenn caught Nara's eye briefly and gave her a small, level nod. Glenn was 45, a border scout, not someone Nara knew well. But the nod said something, and she received it. The dinner shift ended at 8. She walked back to her room and unlocked the door, and Cinder was there, upright, watching the door, the same as every evening. She came in and closed the door and sat down on the floor right there, back against the wall, legs stretched out. She did not say anything for a while. Cinder walked over and sat beside her. Not in front of her, not performing comfort at her. Beside her. The same way a person sits beside someone who needs company but does not need words. She put her hand on his back. She felt his breathing, slow and even. "We are going to be fine," she said to him, or maybe to herself. She was not always certain, with Cinder, who she was talking to. The next evening was when it happened. Nara had been given permission to bring Cinder to dinner. There was no formal rule against animals in the dining hall, and Soli had suggested it, saying that keeping him hidden in the room would only make the story bigger. "Let people see him," Soli had said. "A real thing in front of you is always smaller than the story about it." So Nara brought him on the simple cloth lead she had made from a piece of strap. He walked beside her with his head level, not straining forward, not looking around the way puppies usually do in new spaces, curious and wild-eyed and pulling at everything. He simply walked beside her, matching her pace, with the manner of someone who had been in many rooms and found most of them unsurprising. He was 4.5 weeks old and he moved like he was much older. People noticed him immediately. Several conversations paused. A couple of the younger pack children abandoned their tables to come closer, and Cinder allowed them to look at him, stood still and patient while their hands hovered near his head, without any distress. Nara sat at the end table, where Soli had saved her a seat, and tied Cinder's lead around the chair leg. He settled under the table without being told. Dinner was loud and warm and smelled like the stew that the kitchen had spent the afternoon making. Nara filled her bowl and ate and spoke to Soli in the measured, easy way they always spoke, and she did not look at Petra's table. She heard it anyway. "And she actually brought it in," Petra said, with the carrying voice of someone who does not lower their voice because they have never had reason to. "That little gray rat on a string. Honestly, it looks sick." Laughter. Nara kept eating. "I read that omegas bond to anything that seems lower than them," Petra continued. "It's a psychological pattern. It's been studied." More laughter, looser now. Some people at the table already moving on, the way group cruelty gets bored of itself when no one is rising to meet it. And then Cinder moved. Not fast, not dramatically. He simply came out from under the table. Nara felt the lead go taut and then go still, and sat beside her chair, and raised his head, and looked at Petra's table. Not at the table in general. At Petra specifically. He looked at her the way you look at something you are deciding about, calm, thorough, completely without fear. And then he made a sound. It was not a bark, it was not a yelp or a whine. It was a growl, but a very specific kind, low and even, like a single note held, with no rising or falling in it. A sound that had no performance in it at all, just information. The dining hall went quiet. Nara put her hand on his back. "Cinder," she said quietly. He stopped. He sat back down beside the chair, tucked his head, and was still. But the room did not immediately return to noise the way it usually does when a small animal makes a brief sound. People were looking. Heads had turned from several tables. And Petra, who had the kind of confidence that had never once been questioned in 22 years, was sitting with both hands around her cup and not saying anything. Nara noticed, with particular clarity, that Petra's knuckles were slightly white. She looked at Cinder. He was looking at the table in front of him now, perfectly composed, his breathing unchanged. Nara looked back at her own bowl. She took another spoonful of stew. "Good dog," she said, very quietly. From the other end of the table, Soli made a small sound that was not quite a cough, and not quite a laugh, and was definitely something in between, and then she went back to her dinner, and after a moment the dining hall went back to its noise, and that was the end of that. Except that it was not, really, the end of anything. It was the beginning. But Nara did not know that yet. She finished her dinner and untied Cinder's lead and walked him back to the lower floor, and she was thinking about the way his growl had sounded, that single low note, and about Petra's hands around the cup, and about how a 4.5-week-old puppy with gold eyes had done in 3 seconds what Nara had never quite managed in 2 years. She was not sure what to call what she was feeling. It was not triumph, it was something quieter than that, closer to the feeling of standing very still in a hard wind, and discovering, with some surprise, that you are not moving. In the room at the end of the corridor, she unclipped his lead. He went to the bed and waited for her to come to bed so he could settle at her feet. She brushed her teeth, turned out the light, lay down. He settled. She felt his weight at the foot of the mattress, solid and warm. Outside in the hallway, the pipes made their usual sounds. Upstairs, the upper floors moved through their nighttime routines. Somewhere above her, Petra was in her room, and Nara did not think about her. She thought about the sound Cinder had made. That single note. No performance, no fear, no asking for anything. Just information. She had spent 2 years making herself small and quiet in this building, being careful, being polite, keeping her face still, and waiting for the usual cruelty to run out of air. She had never once made that sound. She closed her eyes. Cinder breathed at the foot of the bed, steady as a clock. She slept. The 5th week, Nara stopped being able to explain his size. She had expected growth. Puppies grew. She understood this. She had been giving him the basic food from the tin, stretching it with cooked oat flour and vegetable water from the kitchen, and she had assumed he would grow at the pace that small animals grow, gradually, incrementally, in ways you notice only when you compare where they started. That was not what happened with Cinder. What happened was that on a Monday morning in the 5th week, Nara looked at him across the room and realized that he was significantly larger than he had been on Friday, and Friday he had been significantly larger than he had been on Tuesday, and Tuesday he had been larger than Sunday, and she could not find in any of this the gradual, manageable pace she had been expecting. She took him out to the small enclosed yard behind the pack house after her morning shift, the yard where the lower floor residents were permitted to spend time, and she watched him move through the space. He was still gray. His coat was beginning to thicken in the way of a dog building toward its adult fur. His legs were longer, his head was larger, his chest had broadened so that he no longer looked like a puppy who had not finished growing into itself. He looked instead like something that had always been designed to be this size, and was simply arriving at what it had always meant to be. She could not, on her budget, keep up with what he was eating. She did not tell anyone this. She rearranged her own meals, skipped breakfast sometimes, ate smaller portions at lunch, used her staff allowance for his food first, and fed herself from what remained. The kitchen sometimes had extra bread at the end of the evening shift, or a pot of stew that was not going to keep, and Nara developed a careful, unspoken arrangement with one of the junior cooks named Will, who was 20 and not unkind, who would set aside the extra without comment and let her take it at the end of the night. Will never asked what the extra food was for. He did not need to. He had seen Cinder in the corridor once, coming around the corner with the morning's slow inevitability, and he had stepped back against the wall without thinking about it and then looked slightly embarrassed about having done so. "He's fine," Nara had said. "I know," Will said. He did not look completely certain. Cinder had looked at Will with the gold eyes, and Will had looked back and then found something else to look at. That was becoming a pattern. People found something else to look at. It was not that Cinder was aggressive. He was never aggressive. He had not repeated the growl from the dinner hall, and he did not snarl or bark or strain at his lead when other people came near. He was, in all measurable ways, extremely calm, quieter than most dogs, calmer than most dogs, more controlled than dogs 3 times his age. But there was something in the way he looked at things. He looked at things as though he was making a decision about them, as though every person and every space and every sound was being evaluated by some internal measure that he had carried with him from before Nara had lifted him out of the cardboard box. People who had never been looked at that way by an animal, which was most people, found it unsettling without being able to explain why. They would reach down to pet him and then hesitate. They would look at him and look away. They would ask Nara politely how old he was, and then not quite believe her answer. Soli did not hesitate. Soli had looked at Cinder from the beginning with a watchfulness that Nara had noticed but not questioned. She sat with Cinder in Nara's room sometimes in the evenings when she came to bring food or check in, and she would look at him quietly and he would look back, and there was something in those exchanges that Nara could not read. On a Thursday evening in the 5th week, Soli came to the door, and instead of her usual container of food, she had a book under her arm. She sat down in Nara's single chair without being invited, because they were at that stage of their relationship, and she set the book on the table and looked at Cinder for a long moment. Cinder was on the floor near the window. He was growing too large for the bed, though he still slept at the foot of it, and he spent his evenings now on the floor in the particular stillness that was entirely his own, not asleep, not restless, simply present, like a stone that has been in a stream long enough to belong there. "How heavy is he?" Soli asked. "I'm not sure exactly," Nara said. "More than 12 pounds, I think, maybe more." Soli nodded slowly. "He was under 5 weeks old when you brought him home." "He was tiny," Nara said. "I could hold him in 2 hands." Soli opened the book. It was old. The cover was creased and the pages had gone slightly yellow at the edges. A pack history book, the kind kept in the small archive room on the 2nd floor that very few people visited. She had clearly taken it out specially. She found a page near the middle and turned the book so Nara could see it. There was a drawing there, old ink, detailed but faded. It showed a large wolf-like animal with a distinctive build, deep chest, long legs, a head that was slightly wider than proportional, and eyes depicted with a careful ring of shading that suggested, even in black ink on yellowed paper, a particular quality of gaze. Underneath the drawing was a paragraph of text in old pack script. Soli read it aloud, translating as she went. She said, "A rare bloodline. Sentinel animals, some records called them. Others called them bound wolves, or partner wolves. They appeared rarely, sometimes once in a generation, sometimes not at all. The records showed no consistent pattern in their birth. What was consistent was their behavior. A sentinel animal did not bond with a pack. It bonded with one person, one individual, chosen at some point in the earliest weeks of its life, and the bond once made was permanent and ran, according to the oldest accounts, in both directions." Nara looked at the drawing and then at Cinder. Cinder was looking at her. He was always looking at her, or looking at things near her, or positioned so that he could see her from wherever he was. She had noticed this the way you notice something that has been true from the beginning, slowly, over time, until the realization simply arrives without surprise. Soli closed the book. "The eyes," she said. "The growth rate. The way he tracks." She paused. "I have been watching him for 2 weeks trying to find a reason to think I was wrong." "And?" Nara said. "I have not found one," Soli said. They sat in the quiet for a moment. "How many of them were there?" Nara asked. "In the records?" "4 confirmed, in the last 200 years, Soli said. "And 2 more that the record describes but does not name. What happened to them?" Soli was quiet for a moment. 2 of them were taken from the people they bonded with and put into the service of the pack leadership. There are no further records of those 2. Nara looked at Cinder again. He had not moved. He was looking at her with that still gold gaze, and there was nothing afraid in him, and there was nothing confused, and there was no performance in him of any kind. He simply was what he was, looking at the person he had decided about in the first moment she had taken the sack off his head. Nara thought about the beta coming to her door, the polite voice, the offer of compensation, the careful word, relocate. She thought about doors. She thought about bolts. "Soli," she said. "Does anyone else in this pack know what they're looking at?" Soli was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "The beta has been in the archives twice in the past 3 days, she said. Nara nodded once. She did not say anything else. She reached down and put her hand on Cinder's head, and he pressed slightly into her palm, and they stayed like that while outside the window the pack settlement moved through its evening, and the pipes in the walls made their noise, and the world continued being what it was. She was already thinking. She had learned, a long time ago, how to be very still while thinking very hard. She had learned it young, in the corner on a folding cot, listening to a building that did not consider her important enough to be careful around. She knew how to wait. She knew how to watch. And now, for the first time in her life, so did something that was watching back. The beta's name was Owen, and he came to her door on a Friday afternoon with a smile that had been constructed rather than felt. Nara had learned to recognize the difference early. Constructed smiles arrived after a small delay. There was a fraction of a second between the moment the decision to smile was made and the moment the smile appeared, and in that fraction of a second, if you were watching, you could see what was actually there. With Owen, what was there was calculation. He was a man who had spent years being strategic, and strategy was so habitual to him that it showed up even in the moments when he was trying not to show it. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the built authority of someone who had held the beta position for over a decade. He was not a bad person exactly. He was the kind of person who did not think of himself in those terms at all, which was a different thing and sometimes more difficult. He said good afternoon. He said he hoped he was not interrupting anything. Nara said he was not. He said he was there on behalf of the pack leadership, nothing formal, just a conversation. He said they had become aware of the dog she had acquired, and they found it very interesting, and they wanted to make sure he was receiving proper care, which of course he deserved. A dog with his evident qualities. Nara said he was receiving proper care. Owen nodded and looked past her into the room. Cinder was at the far end of the room near the window, and he was looking at Owen with the full weight of the gold eyes, and he had not moved. Owen did not look directly at Cinder. Nara noticed this. He kept his gaze slightly to the left of where Cinder was sitting, the way you keep your gaze to the side of a bright light. "We have some training facilities on the north side of the settlement," Owen said. "Proper handlers, good space, excellent nutrition program. A dog with his potential would thrive in that environment. He's doing well here," Nara said. "Of course," Owen said with a smile. "Of course he is. You've done a wonderful job with him. But these facilities are really designed for animals with specific qualities. And I think you'd agree that he has qualities that deserve professional development. Nara looked at him. What would that arrangement look like? Owen explained it. There would be compensation for her, naturally. A fair amount, he said. Which was interesting because he did not state the amount, which meant the amount was not the point. Cinder would be housed and trained with the pack's animals. Nara would still be credited as his original keeper. She would be welcome to visit. Visit, Nara said. Whenever you like, Owen said. She looked at him for a moment. Cinder had not moved. He was still looking at Owen with the same measured attention, his head level, his breathing unchanged, his body absolutely still. Owen had still not looked directly at him. I'll think about it, Nara said. Owen said that was completely understandable. Take all the time she needed, and gave her a number to contact him when she was ready. He left with the constructed smile still in place. She heard his footsteps in the hall, steady and unhurried, the walk of a man who was not worried because he had not yet considered that there was something to worry about. Nara closed the door. She turned and looked at Cinder. He looked back at her. She crossed to the door and slid the bolt, not dramatically, just slid it, the metal bar moving smooth and quiet into its holder, and the room became a locked room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about the word visit. She thought about 2 sentinel wolves taken from the people they had bonded with, and the absence of any further records. She thought about a boy sitting on a step outside a dry goods store with a cardboard box and a pup with a sack on its head, and the way it had sat in that box without making a sound, just waiting, with those gold eyes behind the burlap looking at a darkness that was temporary. She thought about what Soli had said. The bond ran in both directions. She had not fully understood what that meant in the moment Soli had said it. She was beginning to understand it now. It meant that Cinder had not simply attached to her the way a pet attaches to a person who feeds it. It meant that something in him had recognized something in her, had made a choice, in the way that very old, very particular things make choices, and had organized itself around that choice completely. It meant that when Owen had stood in her doorway with his constructed smile talking about proper facilities and professional development and visits whenever she liked, Cinder had been standing at the back of the room looking at the specific shape of the danger and filing it precisely. It meant she was not alone in this room. She had been alone in rooms for a very long time. She looked at Cinder for a long moment. They are going to try again, she said. He blinked once, slow and deliberate. I know, she said. I know they will. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. The bolt was in the door. She needed a longer plan than a bolt. She needed to think about what she had, which was a room on the lowest floor, an Omega rank that gave her almost no formal standing in pack decisions, 9 days until her next pay, and a dog that was growing at a pace that was going to make him impossible to ignore in roughly 2 more weeks. She needed to think about what that dog was, and what that meant for what she was, and whether the pack's history books, which she had never been invited to read, might contain information about what happened to the person on the other side of a sentinel bond. She needed to talk to Soli. She needed to be careful. She closed her eyes and listened to Cinder's breathing, which was even and steady, and thought about everything she was going to have to learn to do, and about the girl she had been before Friday afternoon, who had been politely thinking things over, and about who she needed to be on Monday morning. The room was quiet. The bolt was in the door. Cinder breathed at the foot of the bed like a slow clock, marking time, entirely unworried. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. She started planning. 3 months earlier, Soli had been sitting in her room on a Wednesday evening when she heard the faint sound of a puppy being carried past in a jacket, and she had thought nothing of it. She had lived through enough pack transitions, 3 of them, over 60 years, to understand that most of the things that felt significant on first arrival were not, and most of the things that actually changed everything arrived quietly, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary evening. She had learned to wait for the second look before deciding what something was. The second look at the dog had been 4 days after Nara brought him home, when Soli had knocked on the door with a container of stew, and the dog had looked at her from the middle of the room with gold-ringed eyes, and had not blinked for a long moment, and she had thought, wait. And then she had gone back to her room and sat very still for a while and thought about the pack history books she had not opened in 15 years, and then she had not slept well. Now it was the 7th week, and Nara was sitting at Soli's table, and Soli was watching her read the 3rd page of notes she had compiled from the archive over the past 2 weeks. Cinder was on the floor between them. He was significantly larger than he had been 7 days ago. His head came now to Nara's hip when he stood beside her. His paws, which Soli had been watching with increasing attention, were the paws of something built for endurance, broad and deep padded, the kind that covered ground without effort. He was 8 weeks old. The information on the page in front of Nara described what Soli already knew and had been adding to, piece by piece, from old records that were scattered across 3 different sections of the pack archive, in the way that inconvenient history tends to be scattered, not quite hidden, but not quite findable by someone who was not looking for it specifically. The Sentinel lineage was old, older than the current pack structure. Older, some records suggested, than the concept of an alpha rank. The animals appeared without pattern, without predictability, without any way to cultivate them deliberately. They were not a breed. They were an emergence. They appeared when they were ready to appear, and they bonded with whoever they chose, and the bond was specific and complete, in a way that ordinary animal attachment was not. The pack, historically, had tried twice to redirect that bond, to take a sentinel animal from its chosen person and retrain it toward the pack's collective use. Both times, the animal had simply stopped functioning, not in a dramatic way, not in the way of an animal that fights or escapes or displays obvious distress. They had simply stopped tracking, stopped responding, stopped doing the things that made them what they were, became in essence very large and very still and very unresponsive, and remained that way until the pack gave up and the records of them ended. What the records did not say, and Soli had been looking for it, carefully, in margins and footnotes and the occasional personal account that had been copied into the archive by hand, was what happened to the person the Sentinel had bonded with. She had found one account, one sentence, in a handwritten margin note in a record from 70 years ago, by a pack historian whose name was partially illegible. It said, "The bond does not belong to one side of it." Soli had sat with that sentence for a long time. "Does the bond change the person?" Nara asked. She was looking at the notes, not at Soli. "I think it recognizes them," Soli said. "I think it finds something that was already there." Nara was quiet for a moment. Cinder looked up at Nara. He did this regularly, looked up at her from whatever he was doing with the brief, complete attention of someone checking in, and then returned to whatever he had been doing. He did it the way you check on something you are responsible for. "The beta came back yesterday," Nara said. Soli already knew this. She had seen Owen in the lower corridor and had understood what it meant. "What did he say?" "He said the offer was time-sensitive," Nara said. "He said the pack leadership had allocated resources, and those resources were committed to a window." She paused. "He said it in a very polite way." "He always does," Soli said. Nara set down the notes. She looked at Cinder for a moment, and Cinder looked back at her. "What happens if I say yes?" Nara said. "He stops functioning," Soli said, "based on the records." "And what happens to me?" Soli picked up her tea and held it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The records don't say. But I think that finding something you are half of, and then having it removed is not a small thing." Nara said nothing for a moment. Outside, the pack settlement had moved into its late evening quiet. The night watch would be starting their rounds soon. In 3 hours, the pack house would be mostly dark, and the lower floors would be still. "There is a pack assembly in 3 weeks," Soli said carefully. "The Alpha hosts one every quarter. All rank members attend. It is one of the few occasions where any pack member may formally raise a status claim or request a formal acknowledgement of standing." Nara looked at her. "A sentinel bond is a documented category in pack law," Soli said. "Old law, but law. It has standing. It has implications." She paused. If it were formally acknowledged at a pack assembly, the pack leadership could not then act against it without violating their own charter. "Who would acknowledge it?" Nara said. "It would have to be the Alpha," Soli said. "And why would the Alpha do that?" Soli looked at Cinder for a moment. "Because the alternative," she said slowly, "is having a sentinel animal in their pack that has not been formally recognized, which, historically, has gone very badly for packs." Nara turned this over in her mind. She thought about the Alpha, a woman named Cora who was in her 50s and had run the pack with the kind of steady efficiency that comes from having done the same job for long enough to have seen most problems twice. Cora was not cruel. Cora was not the problem. Cora was simply surrounded by people like Owen, who acted on her behalf and whose interests did not always precisely align with hers. "Does Cora know what Cinder is?" Nara asked. "I don't know," Soli said. "But I suspect Owen knows that she doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. "If you go directly to Cora," Soli said, "you go over Owen's head." "Which means I need to reach Cora before Owen does," Nara said. "Before Owen realizes you're trying to," Soli said. Nara looked at Cinder again. He was watching her with the gold eyes, fully attentive. the way he always was when she was working something out, as if he could feel the shape of her thinking even when she had not said it aloud. The bond does not belong to one side of it. She was 8 weeks into this. 8 weeks since a boy on a step and 5 coins and a cardboard box and a pup that had waited in the dark without making a sound. She thought about all the years she had spent keeping her face still and waiting for things to pass. This was different. She could feel that clearly. This was not a thing that was going to pass. This was the thing that everything else had been leading to. Moving through all the ordinary days, all the double shifts and wet shoes and cracked phones and laughing tables, and it had arrived the same way it always had. Quietly, without announcement, on an ordinary evening. "All right," Nara said. She reached down and put her hand on Cinder's head. He pressed into it. "Tell me how to get to Cora without going through Owen," she said. And Soli, who had been waiting for this moment since the second look, set down her tea and began to talk. Month 3 began on a morning when Nara walked down the lower corridor and 3 people who had never once moved out of her way in 2 years stepped aside. She noticed it. She noted it and said nothing, and kept walking. Cinder walked beside her. There was no longer any reasonable way to describe Cinder as a dog in the ordinary sense of the word. He was the height of a large wolfhound now, which was not a size that puppies of his apparent breed had any business being at 12 weeks. His coat had come in fully, a deep gray that was almost silver at the edges, thick and close, and his head was the shape of the drawing in Soli's history book, wide and level, with the gold-ringed eyes that had not changed since the first night except to deepen somehow, to acquire a quality that was difficult to look away from once you had started. He did not strain at the lead when they walked through the building. He did not react to noise or movement around him in the way that most dogs do, with the ears going and the head swiveling and the general air of a creature managing a great deal of incoming information all at once. He processed everything with the same composure, the same settled attention, the same air of a person walking through a familiar building on an ordinary errand. The 3 people who stepped aside were upper-rank residents. 2 of them were hunters who had been with the pack for years. The third was the assistant kitchen manager, a man named Dale who had spoken to Nara in the past primarily to tell her which section needed mopping. None of them looked at Nara. They looked at Cinder. And Cinder looked back at them the way he looked at everything, thoroughly, without aggression, with the specific quality of assessment that made people feel that they had just been measured by something they did not fully understand. Then he walked on, beside Nara, and the corridor returned to its ordinary morning sounds. At breakfast, Will the junior cook filled Nara's bowl without comment and added a second roll, which was not standard. She picked up the tray and thanked him, and he nodded, and looked at Cinder, who was sitting at the end of the service counter, and Will said, carefully, "He's really grown." "He has," Nara said. "Is everything okay?" Will said, in the tone of someone asking a question that is actually a different, larger question. "Everything is fine," Nara said. Will nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He did not say it. He went back to the service line and Nara took her tray to the end table and ate her breakfast, and Cinder sat beside her, and the dining hall moved around them the way water moves around something that has decided to be still. She had not heard from Owen in 5 days. 5 days of silence from Owen, who had been appearing at her door every 48 hours with increasing politeness and decreasing patience, was not reassuring. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone has stopped asking and started doing something else. Soli had confirmed this 2 days ago. Owen had visited the Alpha's private office 3 times in a week. The record keeper who managed the Alpha's schedule was a woman named Bess who was old friends with Soli and who had mentioned it in passing, which was Soli's way of finding things out, through a network of old friendships and long memories and the specific privileges of being 60 years old in a small community where most people owed you some warmth. What Owen had said to Cora in those 3 visits, Nara did not know. What she knew was that she had 11 days until the quarterly assembly, and she needed Cora to know what Cinder was before Owen told Cora what Cinder was, because the version Owen told would be designed for Owen's purposes, and Owen's purposes were not hers. She had spent 3 days working out how to reach the Alpha directly. The answer, when it came to her, was obvious in the way that answers sometimes are, hiding inside the most ordinary part of the situation, where she had been standing the whole time. She was a kitchen worker. The Alpha ate 3 times a day. There was a private dining room on the 3rd floor where the Alpha and her immediate family ate most evenings, separate from the main hall. The food went up from the kitchen on a covered tray, carried by whoever was assigned the upper floor delivery rotation. Nara had never been assigned that rotation. It went to the more senior kitchen staff, or to workers who had been specifically cleared for upper floor access. It took her 2 days to arrange the swap. A woman named Clara, who had the Thursday evening rotation and had a standing appointment with the PAC's one medical person on Thursday evenings, was happy enough to trade when Nara offered her Friday evening coverage in exchange. Clara did not ask why. Thursday evening, Nara was given the upper floor tray and sent upstairs. She did not take Cinder. She had thought about this carefully. She could not walk into the Alpha's private dining room with Cinder without it looking like a performance. She needed Cora to see him in a neutral moment, in her own time, when the choice to look was hers. But she had learned, in the past few weeks, that people who had heard about Cinder and not yet seen him were curious. The curiosity was spreading through the PAC in the way things spread in small communities, sideways and quietly, person to person, the way water finds cracks. She knocked on the third-floor dining room door. A voice said, "Come in." The room was small and warm. A woman who was clearly Cora sat at a round table, reading something, in the plain and slightly tired manner of a person at the end of a long day. She was 57, with the kind of face that had been through a lot of weather, and she looked up at Nara with the brief, neutral look of someone accustomed to staff coming and going. Nara set the tray down. "Thank you," Cora said, and looked back at her reading. Nara did not leave immediately. She stood at the edge of the room and said, very quietly, "Alpha, I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Nara. I'm in the kitchen. I wanted to speak with you for 1 minute, if that's all right." Cora looked up again. The neutrality was still there, but it had sharpened slightly. "About what?" she said. "About a dog," Nara said. Cora put down the thing she was reading. She looked at Nara for a moment with the clear, tired eyes of someone who had been in leadership long enough to know when a conversation was actually about something else. "Sit down," she said. And Nara sat. She talked for 7 minutes. She was concise because she had planned it, and because she understood that Cora's time was not something she could ask much of. She said what Cinder was, not with drama but with clarity. She described the history she had read in Soli's notes. She said what the Beta had offered, and what she had declined, and why. She said she was not asking for anything except for the Alpha to know the truth before someone else shaped it. Cora listened without interrupting. When Nara finished, there was a moment of silence. "How old is he?" Cora asked. 11 weeks, Nara said. Cora looked at the table for a moment. "And you paid 5 coins for him." "I paid 15, Nara said. 5 was the asking price." The boy looked cold. Something moved in Cora's expression. Not laughter exactly. Something adjacent to it. "I would like to see him," she said. "I know," Nara said. "I thought you might." She had been careful about this moment. She had known it would come, and she had been careful about how it came, because the first time Cora saw Cinder mattered in a way that she could not let Owen control. "He will be in the lower yard tomorrow morning at 7, Nara said. "That's when we walk." Cora looked at her steadily. "All right," she said. Nara stood. She said good evening and thank you for the minute, and she left the tray and left the room and walked back down the stairs to the lower floor, and by the time she reached her corridor her legs were slightly unsteady. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific feeling of a thing you have been holding very carefully, finally leaving your hands. In the room, Cinder was waiting. He looked at her and she looked back and she sat down on the floor with her back against the bed and he came and sat beside her and she said, 7 tomorrow morning. He pressed his head into her side. "I know," she said, "I know." She sat there for a long time in the quiet of the room, in the good dark, and outside the bolted door the pack moved through its evening, and she let it. The south fence held 3 of them. That was what the scouts reported back in the early morning before the sun had cleared the eastern tree line. 3 unfamiliar figures at the boundary markers, moving in a pattern that was not the pattern of animals wandering accidentally into pack territory. That pattern was loose and curious and easily turned back with sound. This pattern was deliberate. They were moving in stages, stopping to watch the fence, then moving again, and the direction they were moving in was inward. The pack's response was immediate and organized. It had to be. The Alpha had not survived 3 decades of leadership without knowing how to move people quickly and quietly in the right direction. She had the border hunters out within 12 minutes of the first report, with the secondary line positioned 20 yards back, and the lower floor residents, the kitchen staff, the service workers, the Omega rank members, directed to the inner rooms and told to stay. Nara was told to stay. The inner room where the lower floor residents were gathered was a large storage space that doubled as a shelter in emergencies, shelved on 3 sides, fluorescent lighting, a door that bolted from inside. There were 11 people in it. Most of them were quietly frightened in the way of people who had heard enough about rogues to know this was serious. Nara sat on a crate near the back wall. Cinder stood at the door. He was not agitated. He was not pacing or whining or pressing his body against the door in distress. He stood with his head at the exact height of the door handle, facing the door, and he was perfectly, absolutely still. And he was working. She could feel it the way she had learned to feel things about him, not through any single observable behavior but through the total quality of his attention, the direction of it, the way every part of him had organized around whatever he was tracking. The other people in the room had left a clear space around him. She had not asked them to. They had done it the way you do things that your body decides before your mind catches up. Soli was beside Nara, sitting on the adjacent crate with her hands folded in her lap, watching Cinder with the quiet attentiveness that was her specific variety of calm. "Where is he looking?" Soli asked, very quietly. Nara looked at the angle of Cinder's head. He was not looking at the door straight on. He was looking slightly to the right of it, at a place on the wall, which was not the wall, which was the direction through the wall, through the building, through the outer corridor, through the specific geography of the settlement. "South," Nara said, "and east a little." Soli nodded once. She said nothing. Nara looked at the door. She thought about the Alpha's hunters out there, moving in the direction the scouts had reported, which was the south fence straight on, no eastern angle. She thought about the first time, weeks ago, when Cinder had looked out her window in a direction nobody else was looking, and the rogue had been found a mile east of where everyone was searching. She thought about how she had told nobody that story, because she had not wanted to make the kind of claim that would require defending. She looked at Cinder. She looked at the bolted door. She thought about all the times she had been inside the room when things were happening outside it. She stood up. Soli looked at her. "He's looking southeast," Nara said, "not south." Soli said nothing. Her face said, "I know what you are about to do." Nara went to the door. She put her hand on the bolt. The 11 people in the room were looking at her now. She recognized most of them. The junior cook Will was there, near the shelves. 2 women from the laundry. The old groundskeeper named Art, who had worked the Pack settlement for 30 years and never said more than 3 words to her in all of them. She drew the bolt. Cinder stepped back from the door the moment the bolt moved, giving her room, and then was beside her as she opened it, and they went out into the corridor together. The corridor was empty. The pack house had the strange, waiting quiet of a building that has sent most of its people somewhere urgent and is now holding its breath. The overhead lights were on full. Nara's footsteps were loud in it. She went to the side exit that opened onto the lower path running east along the outside of the building. She pushed through the door and into the morning air. It was cold. The sun was up but not warm yet. The eastern path ran along the back of the building and then opened onto the stretch of rough ground between the pack house and the eastern tree line, a long, treeless distance that was usually empty and crossed only by the occasional pack worker going between buildings. It was not empty now. The third rogue was there. Not at the south fence, not anywhere near the south fence. He was 60 yards out on the eastern stretch, in the gap between the pack house and the trees, where the pack's hunters were not, where nobody was looking, having come around the long way while the other 2 held the pack's attention at the south boundary. He had not seen Nara yet. He was moving toward the building. Nara was standing at the side exit with the morning around her and Cinder beside her, and she had approximately 4 seconds to think about what she was doing, and what she thought was, "I was not supposed to be in that room." She was never supposed to be in any of those rooms. She opened her mouth to shout, to bring the hunters around, to signal, to do the sensible thing, and then Cinder moved. He moved the way that, she realized later, she should have expected he would move, not with the dramatic rush of a charging animal, but with the same settled, purposeful quality he brought to everything, as though he had been planning this from the moment he had been standing at the door of the shelter, and there had simply been one more thing to do. He was between Nara and the rogue before she had finished her breath. What happened next took less time than she could properly track. There were sounds, a sharp challenge, a deep and singular sound from Cinder that she had not heard him make before, something that was below the register of an ordinary animal. The rogue stopped. She could see the moment of it, the physical arrest, the way the body goes when something it has been moving toward is no longer a clear path. And then 3 of the pack's border hunters came around the eastern corner of the building at a run, having heard the sound, and the situation was, in a matter of seconds, no longer a situation. The rogue retreated. He was contained at the tree line within 2 minutes. The hunters were efficient and experienced and they did not need her help. and she was aware that she was going to have to explain to multiple people what she was doing outside the shelter, and she was also aware that none of that mattered right now. Cinder came back to her. He came to stand beside her the way he always did, head level, composed, and she put her hand on his back and they stood there in the morning cold while the hunters did their work. One of the hunters was a man named Cal, who was 38 and had been running pack borders since Nara was a child. He came over when the rogue was secured and he looked at Cinder for a long moment, and then he looked at Nara. "You came out of the shelter," he said. "He was east," she said. "He came around. He would have reached the building." Cal looked at Cinder again. He had the expression of a man who was deciding how many things he was going to have to rethink. "How did you know he was east?" he asked. Nara looked at Cinder. Cinder was looking at Cal with the gold eyes. "He told me," she said. Cal looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Cinder for a longer moment. Then he said quietly, "Right," in the tone of someone marking a thing that they are going to be thinking about for a long time. He went back to his hunters. Nara and Cinder stood in the cold morning air, and she kept her hand on his back, and she could feel his breathing, steady and even, and the rogue was contained and the pack was safe, and the morning was just a morning. She did not want to move yet. She stood there a little longer, and he stood beside her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. They had done what they had done. They walked back inside together. The pack assembly was held in the main hall on the first Thursday of the month, the way it always was, in the formal way that packhouse life kept certain things formal, not because the formality was always comfortable, but because it was the shape of the thing, and the shape of something is what keeps it from becoming something else. Nara stood at the back of the hall. This was where Omega rank members stood. It was where she had stood for 2 years at every gathering large enough to require attendance. Back wall, left side, close enough to hear, far enough to be easily ignored. She had stood in this spot enough times that it had stopped feeling like a comment on anything, and had just become the place where she stood. Cinder stood beside her. He was 12 weeks old. His head was level with her shoulder. She had not asked him to sit, and no one had suggested it, and she had known since around week 10 that suggesting it would have been an exercise in both parties being politely confused about what the other expected. He stood where she stood. He sat when she sat. He was with her in the way that was not about command or obedience but about something older and more complete than both of those things. The hall was full. Every rank was represented. The kitchen staff and service workers and groundskeepers were along the back and side walls. The hunters and border scouts were in the middle rows. The upper rank families occupied the chairs at the front, and at the very front, at the long table that ran across the width of the hall, sat the Alpha and the pack's senior members. Owen was at the right end of the table. He had known about the assembly, of course. He had known everything about Nara's meeting with Cora, she suspected, within 24 hours of it. He was very good at knowing things. He had been, since the day after that meeting, entirely courteous and entirely quiet, which was the most uncomfortable version of him. He had not looked at her when she came in. He would look at her after. Cora called the assembly to order. She was at the center of the long table, and the hall went quiet when she stood, because that was what halls did when Cora stood, not from fear, but from the specific gravity of someone who had been in the right place long enough to become part of it. She opened with the ordinary business. Border reports, resource updates, a change to the hunting rotation, seasonal preparations. The hall listened and murmured, and listened again, in the rhythm of people who have heard this structure many times. Owen sat at his end of the table and looked straight ahead. There was a point in every assembly, near the end, when the floor was opened. It was a brief window, traditional, rarely used, occasionally meaningful. Anyone could raise a formal matter. The threshold was low. The outcome was at the Alpha's discretion. Cora reached that point in the agenda and said, as she always said, that the floor was open for formal matters, and she looked out at the hall. The hall was quiet for a moment. Nara did not move from the back wall, but Cora's eyes found her. It was the specific kind of eye contact that is also a question, and the question had an answer in it already, the way certain questions do when the person asking already knows what they are doing. Cora said, "I'll note a matter myself, if there are none from the floor." Owen looked at Cora. The hall looked at Cora. Cora looked at the hall, at the long middle rows and the side walls and the back, and she said, in a clear and perfectly ordinary voice, "The pack archive contains documentation of a specific class of bonded animal. Old classification, rarely seen. Last confirmed instance in this pack, 4 generations ago. We have a confirmed instance now. I want it formally acknowledged. The hall did not burst into noise. It made a specific sound, the low sound of a large group of people adjusting to a piece of information that was both surprising and, in some way they could not immediately name, the answer to a question they had been carrying around for weeks. Heads turned toward the back of the hall, toward Nara, toward Cinder beside her. Cinder did not look at the hall, he looked at Nara. He always looked at Nara. Owen was very still at the end of the table. He had the stillness of a man who had just watched a door close from the wrong side of it. Cora said, "For the record, and per pack law as written, the bond is acknowledged. Its standing is recognized. Any action against the bonded pair requires assembly-level review and is subject to charter." She paused. "Does anyone have a formal objection?" She looked at the table. She looked at Owen. Owen said nothing. He was a strategic man, and strategy was his native language, and the strategy of the moment was silence. He would find another approach. He would think of something. He was already thinking of something. She could see it in the very particular quality of his stillness. But not today. Today he said nothing. Cora said, noted and recorded, and moved to the close of the assembly. The hall began to shift and murmur, the noise of ending, chairs and voices and the general movement of a large group of people released from a formal arrangement. People would talk for a long time about this evening, she knew that. The word would travel through the pack in its usual way, accumulating details and losing others, arriving in different versions at different ears, and that was fine. The formal record was the formal record. It was in the record. Nara stood at the back of the hall and did not move until most of the room had emptied, because she had spent years being careful about doorways and crowds and the particular way that attention falls when it is new, and not yet decided what it means. Soli found her near the end, when the hall was down to small clusters of people making their way to the exits. Soli looked at her and at Cinder and made no comment, which was the full comment. Cal, the border hunter, crossed the hall and stopped in front of her. He looked at Cinder for a moment. Then he gave her the same small, level nod he had given her across the dining hall, weeks ago, over the heads of people who were laughing. She received it. He walked on. The hall emptied. Nara walked Cinder out through the side corridor, away from the main flow, into the quiet of the lower building. The corridor was familiar. Same paint, same smell of floor cleaner, same sound of pipes in the walls. And she walked through it the same way she always walked through it, because the corridor had not changed. But the room at the end of it was not just a storage room at the bottom of the building where an Omega girl slept when no one was looking. She knew this now. She had always been the same person. She had not changed, but she had been in a specific darkness, under a specific cover, waiting the way you wait when you have been somewhere uncomfortable, and you are not the kind of person who makes noise about it. She was out of that now. Cinder walked beside her. She unlocked the door and went in and sat on the bed, and he sat beside it, and the room settled into its evening quiet. And she put her hand on his head and he was warm under it, and neither of them moved for a long time. She thought about the boy on the step, the cardboard box, the burlap sack, the 5 coins and the extra 10 because the boy had looked cold. She thought about carrying something against her chest in the dark and not knowing what it was yet. She thought about what it was now. Outside in the pack settlement, the assembly had ended, and the evening was doing what evenings do, spreading out and darkening, settling over the buildings and the paths and the boundary fences, covering everything evenly. In the lower corridor, in the room at the end of it, Nara sat with Cinder beside her and did not need to plan anything or protect anything or be careful about anything. Not tonight. Tonight she simply sat with him in the quiet, and his breathing was even and steady beside her, and the room was warm, and she had been seen. She had been completely, formally, irreversibly seen. She had not been the one who paid 5 coins for a pup with a sack on its head, waiting to be found. She had thought she was the one doing the rescuing. She understood now, with a clarity that was not new, that had been arriving piece by piece since the first night she had looked into those gold eyes and they had looked back without uncertainty, that it had never been one-sided. She had found him, he had found her, and neither of them had been wrong about what they found.